Okay, the other thing that
You're starting.
yes, the other I'll begin this morning by okay. Calling your attention to the next couple of weeks. There's been a couple of changes. One is the same. Wendell Gunn is scheduled to speak to us next Sunday. And Wendell was the student who integrated Florida State University, 62, 63, now the University of North Alabama. He's currently on the board of trustees of that school. In fact, he actually has his own apartment. The president of the school has given him his own apartment, so anytime it's here there, he's got his place to hang out. So that's great. Anyway, he'll be taking next week, and then the week after, we're going to be finishing 2 weeks from now. We're going to be finishing up what we don't get to today here, but making sure we leave Elaine 15 minutes to cover some things that she will be wanting to cover. I'm not sure you decided completely what that is, but you have given us notes from a great seminar at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and those would be interesting. But anyway, that's the next 2 weeks. What I'm going to do this morning is just go back to a couple of areas we were at last week, emphasizing again a moment or two about politics in the church and the importance of the imperative. You have to talk technically. You have to talk about politics. You don't have to talk about policy. You don't have to talk about Congress or the president. But politics are the way the society is structured and governed, and the way the society takes care of those who are in need of care. And so to say to keep politics out of the church is, in my judgment, essentially to keep half of the message of the church off limits, the other half going to matters of personal piety and spiritual development and so on. When we say that, I think what most of us mean is we don't want partisan politics in the pulpit. We don't want promoting a candidate. There are many churches in the country who do promote candidates from the pulpit, on both the left and the right. I think that's generally a mistake. We don't want what's a clear moral issue politicized, used for political advantage. Stick to the issue, what the issue is. And when we talk about the importance of diversity of thought, that it's great that a church has quite a range of political thought within it, because it's in churches that we can learn from one another and love and respect. And it's one of the greatest places for diversity of thought to be worked out. The other point I made was primary allegiance to the kingdom of God. And if you have your papers with you, on page 4, there was a quote from a Facebook post by the Church of Christ minister, Wes Adams. Don't know him personally except through Facebook. He does have quite a following. But this was a great quote from the week before last. He said, "Do historical facts make us feel guilty?" You know, he's going to the issue of why some people feel the need to ban. See, we always have this balance in the country. At this point in time, people on the right seem to have a desire to ban books from schools, and people on the left seem to enjoy cancel culture. It's pretty much the equivalent. I mean, they should both quit. But so he's going to the issue of do historical facts make us feel guilty? Sometimes when we learn historical facts, we feel a twinge of what is sometimes called guilt, even though we were not present in those historical moments. Perhaps sometimes it's not really guilt we are feeling, but the stripping away of misplaced pride. When our heroes and institutions are demythologized, their pride is often wounded. But this is what happens when we study history. Fact is separated from fiction and myth from reality. So instead of saying, why are you making me feel guilty by telling me this stuff? Maybe we should say, why were my pride and identity ever tied to these people in the first place? At that level, we all have historical favorites and so on. But the fact that, wow, you say something against so-and-so and it's like you attacked me. Really? That's your identity? Well, we boast only in the cross of Jesus Christ. We do not have to protect our pride from uncomfortable historical truths. We do not have to worry about our heroes being torn down. As citizens of the kingdom of heaven, we readily confess that the utter sinfulness of all humanity and the brokenness of all that humanity has and will construct. Our hope is in Christ's kingdom, and he is the only man we exalt. I think it's well put. I think he gets pretty close to, I have no argument with to say. We all make provisional statements, but generally I think what he says there is helpful. I want to go back. Debbie did a great job with talking about the trip last week. I want to make a couple of comments. First, on how that trip was created. And it was essentially created from this book, the U.S. Civil Rights Trail, the Traveler's Guide to the People, Places, and Events that made the movement. And I would highly recommend this book. I mean, I know most people don't read travel guides unless they're planning to travel to that place, and then often they don't either. I'll read a travel guide to a place I know for sure I'm not going to. That's going to be my replacement for never getting it. But this book stands on its own. If you have no intention of ever traveling to some of the places we travel to, read the book anyway. It starts in Charleston, South Carolina, works its way over toward Atlanta and Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery. Goes on across to Jackson, Mississippi, where a lot of things happen. The Mississippi Delta, which plays more in civil rights than I would have thought, over into Little Rock, back through Memphis and Nashville, up into North Carolina, and eventually into the major African American Museum in Washington, D.C. It's from a standpoint of learning, it's a brilliant book because for every location, it is telling you the 3 must-sees in that place. It's going to give you a timeline of the movement. It's going to give you a synopsis of the people that were involved in the civil rights story in that town. And then it's going to give you the sites, and it's going to give you quotes from major players with regard to events that happened in here. And then it gets into accommodations and food and tours and so on. But by the time they've taken you they've basically taken you through the civil rights story from 4 angles at the beginning of every site. And so at the end of that, you feel like, I know Birmingham, I know who the people are, and so on and so forth. And so I call your attention to that book, and then I turn to the big takeaways from the trip. On bottom of page 5, and this was to me maybe the biggest one. The civil rights story is being told best in the South. And it is being told. Now, as a Northerner, I didn't know that. I thought, well, we tell the story. You can trust us most. But when you go to the South and you actually see how well composed the memorials and museums and the institutes and the historical sites are you just have to be really impressed. This was not true 50 years ago, but it is true today. The South has reclaimed its story, and it's telling it very well. Another major point is the civil rights movement isn't over. I was getting a little depressed a year or two ago by supposing, well, America finally became mature enough to be able to handle a black president. And then what happened? I mean, we just burst out in racism again. And as if the civil rights movement was just forgotten. No, it's always been this way with the civil rights movement. It's always a cycle of progress made through great sacrifice and heroic leadership, and then pushback. It's just a cycle. It just keeps going. And we're in the middle of it now. You're just at different places in that cycle, and you say almost every 20, 25 year thing, great progress is made. Human beings are going who are troubled by that progress are going to push back. And then the people who are supportive of that progress are going to push ahead farther. And then it's going to be pushback. And it's not a matter of ever feeling the story's over, that the story's forgotten. It's not. The movement just keeps going on and will for some period of time. Another takeaway, I think, for both Debbie and I was the historic kindness of Black Americans. If you know the history, you know that there's been people prone to violence, both Black and white. But when you just run into people, even in this church, but especially on our trip, it was just Black people are just really friendly and caring. And when you know their story, you think how remarkable, how absolutely remarkable. But the default position is politeness and kindness and good sense and good humor. We made a number of discoveries. I think Debbie covered that. And I turn to the timeline. So this is really where we're picking up this morning. From enslavement to mass incarceration, and how essentially we're running through a timeline of Black history, and you'll see where some of the things we talk about geographically fit in. But there was 250 years thereabouts of enslavement through the end of the Civil War, and then Reconstruction came in. Under Republican Abraham Lincoln and his successors in the Republican Party, Ulysses Grant as president, and so on, substantial reconstruction of the country and substantial improvement in civil rights. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. When you're thinking about civil rights, those are very important amendments to keep track of. The 13th banned slavery. It's good. Except as a punishment for crime. Well, banned slavery except as a punishment for crime. You wouldn't believe the spike in Black crime in the next 10 years. I mean, Black codes and almost anything became a violation. And in a lot of communities in the South, they found their way around the 13th Amendment by that exception, except as a punishment for crime. 14th Amendment is what gives citizenship to all natural born Americans, Black, white, whatever. It also goes to due process and equal property. Equal something. I don't equal property makes sense. Due process is important. And then the 15th Amendment is voting rights, which were determined way back then. And then again in 1965. Okay. Reconstruction didn't last long. You come to the election in 1876. Now talk about an election that, we think we've been through a few. The election in 1876 was way more crazy than anything in my lifetime. And here was the deal. Republican Rutherford Hayes was running against the Democrat, Samuel Tilden. And so the Republicans had been the party of Reconstruction, right? But at that point in time, they do not get the majority vote, and they don't quite get the electoral vote. They're 20 votes short of Rutherford Hayes becoming president. And so all sorts of negotiations begin in the Senate, and the determination, a deal is made. Rutherford Hayes, Republican, will become president of the United States with enough votes of Southern Democrats if the Republicans will get the federal forces out of the South. Follow what just happened there? I mean, the Republican technically wins, Reconstruction is over. It's back to local militias, it's back to essentially the white aristocracy controlling the South as it did before. Major election and a major turning point. That takes us to the Jim Crow era, which lasted for 75 years, the early 1950s. Included things like black codes, the Ku Klux Klan. Am I the only one that's always said Ku Klux Klan? That's another thing I learned on the trip. I need trips to learn kinds of things. Lynchings and the policy of separate but equal. And then you come to the struggle for civil rights from 1950 on. Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court rules against segregation of education facilities. No more separate but equal, but integrated schools. It takes ages for that to be applied, but it's like in 1954, the Supreme Court rules. The murder of Emmett Till on August 28th, 1955, in some ways that marks the beginning of the civil rights movement. He's murdered in the Mississippi Delta. He's a 15-year-old boy spending time with an extended family in a small town in the Mississippi Delta. You know what the Mississippi Delta is? It's like not in the Gulf. So it's inland about 200 miles, and it's where the Mississippi does some convoluted kinds of things, and it's Delta land. It's closer to Memphis than it is to New Orleans. Just to keep track of geographically where that's happening. Anyway, Emmett Till is there in a general store. A white woman accuses him of talking to her insolently or inappropriately or disrespectfully. And that night, her husband and a friend of her husband go to Emmett Till's place, take him out, torture, kill, and throw him in the river. They found him pretty quickly. They had a trial in a month, and not surprisingly, found him not guilty. What happened a whole lot of times. But here's what turned the point is Emmett Till's body is taken back to Chicago, and the devoted mother has the wisdom to say everything's going to be open casket. The world is going to see how my son has been beaten. And so you're going to see in that open casket thousands stream by. The other thing that's happening that promotes the civil rights movement is television. A lot of things couldn't have happened prior to television, but when it starts getting televised around the country, you can't escape the impressionist that goes on. And Emmett Till's body in that coffin completely awakened the country to we have a problem here. and so on. Okay. Rosa Parks, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, in a 390-day Montgomery bus boycott that comes after that. It's during that time that MLK, Martin Luther King, pastor of the Dexter Baptist Church in Montgomery, comes to national prominence. He is a kid. I mean, he's 26, 27. He doesn't act like a kid. I'm just saying how young he was. I mean, you know, in fact, that's how he became the leader of the movement, that all the more seasoned pastors said, not us. And the new guy in town, he can do this. But it was meant to be, and that's where the Martin Luther King story picks up. The Little Rock Nine, Central High in Little Rock, integrating there. Many of the pictures you see from the movement come from Little Rock Nine entering Central High with National Guard and so on. Lunch counter sit-ins in the 1960s. The first prominent one was in Greensboro, North Carolina. The most successful one was in Nashville, Tennessee. I wish I could tell the story of Nashville, Tennessee in detail and remember the mayor's name. But John Lewis and a number of others were part of that sit-in. And at one point in time, the leaders of the sit-in got an interview with the mayor of Nashville. And they asked him if he thought it was fair, that it was right, that lunch counters were segregated, that shopping was segregated, and so on and so forth. Does that strike you as fair? And 9 times out of 10, a white leader at that point in time would have found a way to obfuscate that and kind of work their way around it. And the mayor of Nashville said, no, it does not strike me as fair. Nashville essentially had a clean record from then on, just because one person spoke the truth at great political risk to himself. But at that point, the lunch counter sit-ins were over. The city was integrated in those ways, and very few civil rights struggles or riots or anything else happened in Nashville. Essentially, it comes down to that moment when a mayor said, you're right, you are right. End of the violence, well, it wasn't violent, these were completely non-violent at this point. The Freedom Rides in the spring and summer of 1961, people from largely from the north. It had to do with integrating. The law said that you could now integrate public transportation. It needed to be integrated, but no one was enforcing it. So black and whites from the north rode buses from Washington, D.C. and on, and showed up in cities like Birmingham and got beat within an inch of their lives. Some amazing stories of heroism. John Lewis, for instance, he didn't get beat up worse, but you know, we think of the martyrs of the civil rights movement. John Lewis died a natural death, but after having been beaten more than any other person, as far as I can tell, imprisoned dozens of times. You know, I remember him now from the 1990s on, as a distinguished congressman and a powerful voice in Washington. Well, he got there the honest way, by getting beat up over and over and over again. And that was all part of the Freedom Rides. The Children's Crusade in Birmingham in May 1963, where the clergy in Birmingham organized essentially high schoolers to march for an end to segregation in Birmingham. But that's where Bull Connor comes in with the dogs and with the fire hoses, and 14, 15-year-old kids plastered up against walls by the power of fire hoses. TV is catching it all. And that would have happened 10, 15 years ago, and nothing probably would have come from it. The TV catches it this time. The assassination of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963, a remarkable person. The March on Washington that same summer, the I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King. But what's amazing is, so August 28th, Martin Luther King gives this great iconic speech that seems like it changes American history. And 18 days later, 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham is bombed and 4 little girls die. With almost a reaction to the speech. It's always point to counterpoint. Progress, pushback, progress, pushback. And the youth of these girls and the pictures of these girls, again, just alarmed the nation. Powerful moment. Freedom Summer in 1964, and this had to do with voting rights and voting registration. All sorts of young people from around the country, some southern, many northern, came into areas like Mississippi and started trying to register Black voters. This celebrated case here was the murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, June 21st in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And you gotta watch it. There's a couple of interesting things about that story. One is the car that these 3 men drove was given by, what's the name of the synagogue? The temple that
Temple Israel of Northern Westchester.
Yeah. Eddie's been there for 25 years, and it's a temple that's been very involved in civil rights from the beginning. The other thing is, Philadelphia, Tennessee, Mississippi, is a really small, isolated place. When a major national candidate for president launches his campaign in that kind of place, you can't miss the symbolism of what that person is trying to say and who he's playing to. I'll leave it there. Anyway, it leads to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A year later, the assassination of Malcolm X, February 1965, in New York City. We still don't really know what happened. Malcolm X is a major character here. He's always thought of as counterpoint to Martin Luther King. Historians now doubt that they both held to an awful lot of things in common. It's thought that Malcolm X was killed by a Nation of Islam people because he'd fallen out with them. But there's questions about, he was a convenient person to get rid of for a lot of people. And so his assassination is a major event. We still have major parts of the timeline. Bloody Sunday in Selma is after that. A few weeks after that in Selma, Alabama, Bloody Sunday, John Lewis and numbers of others try to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to start a march to Montgomery, 50 miles away, the state capital, and they are beaten back and beaten to bloody pulps in some cases. Martin Luther King and others then come down to Selma. A week later, they march across the bridge again. They are met with the state militia, state National Guard, and Martin Luther King, in his nonviolence, just turns them around and they go back. But a week later, at that point, Lyndon Johnson and others intervened and they nationalized the National Guard. And now the National Guard will be protecting the marchers when they make it to Montgomery. Leads fairly later in that year to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 3 years later, the assassination of Martin Luther King, April the 4th, 1968, Lorraine Motel, Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, quickly the aftermath. What I hope you maybe see here, what are the patterns and what are the themes? Maybe telegraph one or two of them, but what are you picking up on? Now, let me go on and mention the aftermath while you're sort of figuring that out. Assassination of Martin Luther King, and the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and the assassination of Malcolm X, and the assassination of Edgar Everett, and televised accounts of civil rights protests. After the assassination, it leads to the riots in the summer of 1968. Nonviolence slides. Guess what? We just killed the guy who was the nonviolent spokesperson. You know, one person did it, but he represented the spirit of a lot of other people. That leads to the rise of Black Power and Black Panthers. And now I'm going to tell you something. You know, most white people, when they hear Black Panthers, just know those are the bad guys. Those are the truly bad guys. We should know a little more about them from that. What they did in communities like Oakland is really protected neighborhoods, took care of neighborhoods, saw that community service was rendered, saw that it was safe. The other thing that happens is when you start looking at solitary confinement, a story by Alfred Fox called Solitary. It talks about his experience in Louisiana in prison, and he's just a kid on the run, and has done things that end him up in prison. And there's he should be. His life isn't going anywhere until he gets in prison and the Black Panthers get hold of him and tell him to grow up. And they basically said, you've got to live a life that has purpose and meaning and character. You have to look like a responsible human being. And that story happens over and over in the history of Black Panthers too. That they take kids and say, listen, act with dignity. If you expect dignity, act with dignity. Demand dignity, but you can't demand dignity if you don't have it yourself. But that's what I'm saying is almost all of these things have more complexity than you first realize. Also, the aftermath of the 1960s is the rise of anti-government ideology, which is still essentially marks the country at this point. In the mid-60s, when you did a survey, do you trust the federal government? 75% of people would say yes. 10 years later, 25% would say. Coincidence? Black people are getting equal rights. A lot of people don't like it. Why did the federal government impose that on us? And so, I can understand Washington gives you story after story that might make you want to react. It's always been that way. But that turning into government is the problem. If government is the problem, then we don't have a chance. Because they are there to serve and make the country greater. And if we've already ruled ahead of time that they are a mess and we need as little of them as possible, and then we look around and say, why don't we have the services anymore? What happened to the infrastructure? What happened to, why is medical care so complicated in this country? But it's connected, it's part of the aftermath here. And that leads to war on drugs and mass incarceration. Okay, for our purposes today, to keep getting into next week and to get Debbie up here, the thought questions. I'm going to ask the first two rhetorically, and maybe we'll come back to them in 2 weeks. But here's a fundamental question that comes out of the civil rights thought that I've been able to do, and that is, what is the role of church in critiquing how our democratic nation is governed and structured, and how care is taken for those in need? And, you know, based on tradition and so on, and because everything's kind of seemed like fine and okay in the 70s and 80s, and no big problem. I mean, Watergate, a few other things, but you know, no really big problem. No, just stay out of that. So, wait a second. The role of the church in critiquing how a democratic nation that expects its people to be citizens, how a democratic nation is governed and structured, and how care is taken for those in need. What is the role of the church? We may have a chance to open that up for discussion in 2 weeks, but the bottom line is we're not going to come up with an answer. You know, we're not going to come up with an answer that's going to satisfy all of us. You know, but it's a question. That's my point, is that's a question, and it can't be nothing. Because at that point, the church has just lost its ethical, moral, even reason for being at that point. And go on from there and say, where are these matters better discussed than where grace and love reign? You know, the fact that you used Ken McAdams last week, that Ken and I might have very different views of things, but love one another and worship God together and hear one another. And my views are sharpened and made better sense because I've listened to Ken. I'm not sure it worked the other way. But I mean, it helps to talk to people who don't see it exactly the way you do, but whom you love and respect, and they love and respect you. Okay, and then the importance of narrative in the country, of how you frame the national narrative. We will talk about that in a couple of weeks. Debbie's going to come up and look at questions 5 and 6. I'm sorry, it's not Debbie's fault. You have about 5 minutes to do one of them.
So this is actually your time to talk, not mine. So I wanted us to look at the question, the 5th one. What place does shame or guilt have in tracking Black history from this enslavement, you know, throughout history we just went through? And I kind of just giving you a taste of it. Have most of you seen some pictures or something of what is commonly called the lynching museum? You have some visual of that.
You, my friend, on Facebook, you'll get them.
The pillars that are kind of hanging down from the ceiling that look like coffins. If you have to feel it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was on our last day of our trip, and we went out to that memorial site. And so you kind of start off with it, you know, okay, this is interesting, this is informative. But the deeper you kind of walk through this maze, kind of all the way going down all the way through. And when you start, the pillars that are hanging are kind of like with you. You know, you can look at them, you can read that each of them represent a county where lynching took place, and you could read the names of the people who had been lynched in that particular county. And then you go a little bit further, then they're up, because you're walking down, you're up here, and you just keep walking, and then there's just the overwhelming number of them, and knowing that there's so many people that each of these pillars represent, and then they just are hanging down, and it just hits you as in such a deep emotional way, at least it did for me. And it reminded me a lot of when Dale and I were able to be in Poland some years ago, and we were in Auschwitz. And the kind of feeling I got going to Auschwitz, and the feeling like, how could humanity do this to other human beings? That was kind of the big, not how did the Germans do this to the Jewish people? It wasn't so much just that, how do human beings do this to other human beings? So that was a lot of my feeling coming out of that memorial. And I just felt a strong sense of a need to speak to a Black person. That in the moment I walked out, just to say, I have to say something of healing. I have to say I'm sorry. Not that I thought it was my fault, but I represented the kind of anger and fear that motivated people to lynch other human beings. And so that was my emotional feeling from that one. The gentleman who had welcomed us in had to go through a security scanning was the same person I saw walking out, this Black man. And I just had to go up to him and say, I am so sorry. This is what we've done to your people. And I think when I got back, I think I said the same thing to both Laconia and Eddie, because that was just a sense of, and I wouldn't say I felt guilty or shameful personally, but I felt that as identified as a human being, as a Christian. So I just, throwing that out to begin, I want you to kind of look at this question is, why do I think people often react to these stories with a sense of shame or guilt?
There have been lately studies and articles written about generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that obviously the generational trauma has been strong through the African American Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And on the reverse end, taking sort of and I'm making this up, generational responsibility, because the way that our people treated Black Americans allowed us to advance more quickly and, profit basically, and education, financially, everything, property, everywhere. And there are families who could, who have inheritance that, with money that goes on for generations. But the Black community does not have that because of the historical oppression made by the people with the historical advantages. And so there does have to be at least a mindset of how, of understanding that, of acknowledging that I've benefited personally from racism. That's the bottom line. I mean,
No, you don't, but you don't know that.
What's that?
I mean, we feel like we do, but in fact, we don't benefit from racism.
Right,
Yeah.
no,
But
but
we feel that way and we get ahead.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. At the end of the day, no, it's a.
We all suffer from racism.
We all suffer from racism, but I have benefited.
Opportunities were, you're saying opportunities were presented to you that might not have presented to
Absolutely.
American women of your age and
Absolutely.
Yeah. We have what?
Jane, but
Jane.
we have about 2 minutes.
2 minutes, Jane. Or maybe
I may have not heard all this clearly, but my family did benefit from the race in terms of the accumulation of wealth from the racist policies that the United States government implemented after the Civil War. White people could homestead land across the country. Black people couldn't. My people homesteaded land, and I have inherited some of the wealth that came from that.
And Black.
After the Second World War, white soldiers came home and got the GI Bill. Black soldiers didn't. And with the GI Bill, they got college educations, they bought homes with decent mortgages, and their families not me personally, but some parts of my family have inherited. And so I want to support what Debbie said. This is not about making anybody feel guilty or shameful, but it is about recognizing what happened and who benefited and who didn't. And then what does it take to bring justice to the situation that we find ourselves in today? And I really liked your point, Dale, about what's the church's role in what it might take to bring some justice into the situation. And for me, a first step has just been acknowledging the privilege that comes with looking like this. And I know some of these words I'm using are loaded words, but there's a certain privilege with having straight hair that hangs and skin that looks like this, and a farm back in Illinois that can fund my retirement. So I really have appreciated these 2 weeks. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I look forward to reviewing more of this. And I guess my hope and prayer is that it doesn't stop here.
Right. So I think we will conclude our morning with that comment, and hoping that this will not stop here, but we'll be continuing 2 more weeks dedicated to discussing these things. And then hopefully going forward, we'll be as our thoughts, our actions, our behaviors will be informed by this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.